Good afternoon. I'm Nicola Longford. I'm Executive Director of the Sixth Floor Museum, and it's wonderful to welcome you all here for this very special program. We are delighted to welcome Julian Reed to share details about his unique memories and perspectives of before, during, and after November 22nd, 1963. Julian Reed started his career in media and public relations young, very young.
Years ago.
He was a cub reporter for the Scripps Howard Fort Worth Press at the age of 18. He founded his own fledgling advertising and publicity shop, and he became involved in the John B. Connally's successful campaign for governor of Texas in 1962. And he remained his counselor and confidant for more than 30 years until his death in 1993. He served as Connolly's representative to the national media for Kennedy's visit to Texas in November 1963. Based in Austin, Reed remains active in public relations. He devotes much of his time in support of historic preservation, and he's been a terrific friend to the Sixth Floor Museum, and we're honored, really honored, to have him here today to talk about his new book, JFK Final Hours in Texas, An Eyewitness Remembers the Tragedy and Its Aftermath. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Julian Reed.
Thank you, Nicola. It's wonderful to be here in a place that I've grown to love and that I think all of America appreciates more every passing year. I'm particularly pleased to see in this audience today so many of my friends. I'm really honored that so many of them have turned out here today. I couldn't possibly take the time to introduce all of them, but two of them I do want to recognize are here because they're really part of the story. You all know the general story about how, although the president was killed that day, that Governor John Connally was very gravely wounded, and we didn't know for many hours whether or not he would survive. Well, one of the persons who had more than a passing interest in that is with us here today. And I'd like to introduce Mark and Ann Connolly. Mark. How many of you were old enough to have a memory on November 22nd, 1963? Well, that's pretty good. Pretty good. Okay, second question. How many of you remember where you were and what you were doing on November 22nd? Well, you have just demonstrated what has become a phenomenon, because basically anyone who did have a memory at that time can tell you where they were and what they were doing. I see you nodding over here. What were you doing, sir?
I was a sophomore at Hackensack High School in New Jersey.
In New Jersey?
I came here this morning.
Really? Well, welcome. So this was a long way away from you, but you were shocked the rest of the world.
We followed it and
Really? It's amazing. It's a worldwide story, I think, as we all know. Well, I was in a motorcade outside this building. And I'll have more to say about that as I go along, obviously. But that, of course, is a memory that's etched in my brain and always will be. Every fall after the assassination, Governor Connally, with whom I worked for his lifetime and mine, political lifetime, every fall he would be besieged with calls from the media to relive that experience. And I would set up those interviews. Every fall we'd take probably 3 afternoons at his law office to do interviews from media from all over the world. We'd do that ritual year after year after year. The story never went away. After he passed away, I did the same for Nellie Connally for years until she passed away. She wrote her own book in 2006, and I helped her with that book, and we traveled across the country on a book tour for her. So I did that all those years, but I never wrote my story. It so happened that after I had spent days and nights at Parkin Hospital, amid all the clutter that was on my desk, makeshift desk, My assistant, named Marla Pratt Westfall in Fort Worth, took all that stuff and put it in a big envelope, put it away in the files, and I actually didn't even know about it. In 1998, I got a big envelope in the mail one day, huge envelope, oversized envelope, and inside was a collection of things I didn't even remember I had. For example, a total manifest, a copy of the original manifest of everyone who was on Air Force One that day came to Texas. A list of all the newsmen from the Capitol in Washington who came down on that trip. And there were scribbled notes that I made, during those 3 days and 3 nights. And I'd sort of forgotten all those. Well, with the 50th, I put that in a drawer. Obviously, didn't do anything with it. But when the 50 started coming up here about a year and a half ago, I thought I really ought to do that for history, not for me, but for history. Not because we don't all know the general story, you all know the headline story, you all know the sub-headline story, but I'm doing what I call filling in the gaps of history, because there are a lot of things that people do not know about that era. So that's what I've tried to do, and I'll get to my experience here shortly. But starting with the trip itself, how the trip was planned, what was the strategy of the trip? You've all read, I'm sure, and heard over the years that President Kennedy came down here to solve the political differences between the conservative Democrats and the liberal Democrats, wings that were led primarily by Ralph Yarborough, Senator Yarborough for the liberals, and Lyndon Johnson and Connolly for the conservative forces. That was the purpose, supposedly, of the trip. In fact, there are several books out with that in print. While any visit to Texas would obviously bring together different factions of political party, that was not the main purpose of the trip. The main purpose of the trip was simply to raise money. President Kennedy was fascinated by the idea that there were a lot of what he called rich Texans down here, and not without some cause. And he had been pushing the Vice President and Governor Connolly to come to Texas ever since he was elected in 1960. Well, Governor Connolly resisted that. He was to be the host of the trip, of course. He resisted that because he had just been elected governor in 1962, just the year before, and he had the first legislative session facing him that he had as governor. He was busy with that session, getting his feet on the ground, and he didn't have the time or the inclination to want to plan a presidential visit under his sponsorship. That's a big, big job. So he kept stalling, and Vice President Johnson did as well. The other point here that you have to remember is that Kennedy was not all that popular in Texas at that time. The Civil Rights Bill had brought a lot of pushback in Congress. There were other factors involved. Anyway, to have a successful trip for him was not a slam dunk, no matter who you were. And Connolly was virtually unchallenged politically, very popular at that time. So they kept stalling. Finally in April, only in April, that late, April of 1963, at a meeting in El Paso with the president, and Larry Temple, a member of his staff, was there and reported on it afterwards. They agreed to do the trip. The original request from the White House, because of this interest in money, was to have 5 fundraisers in 5 cities in Texas. And Governor Connolly pushed back against that, as you would think he would, and he said, no. We don't want you to come to Texas and look like you're raping Texas for money. Well, the White House listened to that, and what we ended up with was 1 fundraiser in Austin. I'll get to that in a minute. Governor Connolly, very wisely, knew that if Kennedy, with his charisma and with Ms. First Lady's attractiveness, that if people saw him in the right light, in the right situation, he told Nellie Connolly this. He said, if they can see the President and First Lady in the right circumstances, presented in the right way, they will like him. That was his quote, they will like him. So he set about using his influence in Texas to set up a plan that would be largely non-political. The first event was in San Antonio, where he dedicated a new medical facility for Brooks Air Force Base. That's totally non-political. Huge throng of people. They landed in San Antonio, all the way through town, throng of people jamming the streets, a triumph. They left there and went to Houston later in that day. And they appeared. He was a host, a guest, at a mammoth dinner honoring a very prominent Democratic congressman, Albert Thomas, who was head at that time of the House Appropriations Committee, a position that was very important to the president, obviously, for anything he wanted to do. That was the second stop. That was the only stop on the entire trip that Jackie Kennedy spoke. And most people don't know that she ever spoke. She spoke to a group of LULAC Mexican Americans at the Rice Hotel before the dinner. There's a picture of that in my book. It's a great picture of her speaking. So that was a highlight, obviously, of the Houston trip. The only place she ever spoke. Then they went to Fort Worth late that evening. They didn't arrive till after 11 o'clock. Been a long day for them because they flew down from Washington that morning, did San Antonio, the crowd's there. They did Houston, the crowd's there. So they got to the Texas Hotel about 11 o'clock at night. Even though it was that late, they landed at Carswell Air Force Base. Even though it was that late, they had a throng of people meeting them at the airport. All the way into town, they had little knots of crowd along the way, not big crowds on the road. They got to the Texas Hotel close to midnight, and here was a throng of people waiting for them. They went upstairs and went to bed. Governor Connolly, who was the host, I met him there. I was there. He held court in the coffee shop for another hour, as he liked to do. That was his hometown. So he liked to do that, and he had reporters gather all around him. We just shot the bull for another hour. But the Kennedys, meantime, went to bed. They didn't see when they checked in. They were in a suite which was originally very drab. The backstory of that was, originally the plan was to put them in the Will Rogers suite, named after the famous personality. And it's a lovely suite, beautiful suite. But the Secret Service deemed that unsafe because it had 3 entrances. So they ruled that out, wouldn't let the President and First Lady stay there. So they put them in this other suite, which was very drab. So the host committee was horrified. Bring the president to Fort Worth and put him in a dinky hotel room. So they went to work with 5 days, and a woman named Ruth Carter Johnson was the daughter of Amon G. Carter, who was a publisher of the Star-Telegram, a very powerful leader in the city. They went to work to gather in the arts community a collection of 15 pieces of world-class art and statuary, and they redecorated that suite. So here it was like a museum in that suite in the Hotel Texas. Well, they didn't pay much attention to it that night because they were tired. Next morning, they woke up and really saw this, and there was a little pamphlet laying on the furniture. And they saw it, and they were so struck by it that they called Ruth Johnson at home. Her daughter was home sick from school. She didn't come to some breakfast. Called and thanked her for it. That was thought to be the last telephone call he made, other than his own inside business, before he died. Now, I'm telling you that story now because we're going to come back to it a little later. Anyway, he goes down to address, well, first of all, the event there was a Chamber of Commerce non-political event. There were about 2,500 people bought all the tickets for that. Well, a lot of the supporters of Kennedy were upset they couldn't buy tickets. So they laid on another event, and that was a rally across the street from the Hotel Texas on a huge vacant lot. 5,000 people were on that lot that morning in a misting rain. Some of them started lining up at 5 o'clock in the morning. So he, Vice President Johnson, Congressman Jim Wright, Senator Don Kennard, a whole delegation of leaders, led him out there, and he stroked this strong, huge crowd out there. He did that first. They wanted to know where Jackie was. She didn't go out there with him. He said, well, she's still taking time. It takes her more time, but then she looks better than Lyndon and me afterwards. So that's what happened there. Then they go inside, they do the breakfast, huge throng, sellout crowd there. So they're on a roll, everything is good. They come out, by the time he speaks, before they even did the breakfast, the clouds parted. Beautiful blue sky, false blue sky, puffy white clouds. Everybody was exhilarated. Well, happy time, including me, because I originally had planned to go back to Austin after that because I was supposed to write some remarks for Governor Connolly for the event that night. Well, I got all carried away. You know, I was having a big time myself, and I thought, man, I can't leave this. I got to have more of this. So I jumped on the White House press bus with the rest of the press from Washington. We go out to Carswell, get on a chartered press plane. That was Pan Am days. Remember Pan Am? Any old enough to remember Pan Am? It was Pan Am charter. We flew for 14 minutes to Love Field in Dallas. Long flight. Anyway, we got to Dallas. Same thing. He gets off the plane. There's a throng of people waiting for him out there. He gets so carried away with that he and Jackie leave the Secret Service and go work the fence. Well, the Secret Service, of course, were annoyed, but they let him do it. But the feeling was so warm and wonderful. The weather was beautiful now. You know, everybody was excited about it. So we have 2 press buses. I got on the first press bus because I was sort of helping a young deputy on the bus just decide what the press people wanted. So we get in the motorcade, start to downtown Dallas, come in on Lemon Avenue, go down to get on Main Street. So we come down Main Street in this direction. The crowds got the larger. Every block you saw a bigger crowd. People hanging out of skyscrapers on either side. You had people 6, 7 rows deep on either side. Barely room for the limousine to get through with an escort. And here we were just rolling along, and the press, who were very skeptical, of course, about him coming down here, you know, they were talking about maybe getting rid of Johnson for the next election, you know, things like that. They were saying, well, we don't have this city of hate, you know, this is a bad deal. He'll be badly received here. Well, they couldn't believe what they were witnessing, because it's just the opposite. So aboard the bus, there was this happy kind of banter now. You know, we'd reached this turnaround. Everybody was having a good time. So we come down Main Street. I'm sitting in the right front seat of the bus. That's the part of the bus, you know, that's flat against the wall, you know, parallel to the wall. From that position, I could see across the driver down onto the street where the bus turned. But just before we get there, that was the time Mrs. Connolly had just turned to the president and said, "You certainly can't say Dallas doesn't love you, Mr. President." And then I looked right down there, was looking right at them. They had turned, made the turn. They were just passing out of the building, and all of a sudden, pop, pop, pop. Well, we had no idea what happened. Remember, no cell phones, no communication. Nobody knew what was happening. So we had to decide quickly. I first hoped and thought maybe it was a backfire from a motorcycle, because we had them all around us. You know, the police were everywhere. But then I saw 2 things. I saw the limo almost stop for a moment and then lurch forward and disappear on the triple underpass. At the same time, I saw pandemonium on the street. I saw mothers knocking their children down on the grass, covering them up. I saw people running around. I saw a motorcycle policeman heading up that grassy lawn that's been called now the grassy knoll forever in history. All that was happening. So we knew something bad had happened, but we didn't know exactly what. So I and Jiggs Fulver, who was on the bus with me for the White House, we had to decide what to do with that bus. So we decided that although we didn't know for sure, we probably thought it would go to the hospital. We knew that Parkland was just a few miles away. So we took the bus to Parkland Hospital immediately. We never saw the limousine because they went a different place. You know, we saw a different direction. We went to Parkland. We didn't go to Parkland, I'm sorry. They went to Parkland. We went to the Trademark, where we had almost 3,000 people waiting for us. I pulled up quickly with the bus, jumped out of the bus. The newsman quickly ran to telephones on the line. You remember when they had pay phones all down public buildings? They all ran to the pay phones. I ran in and ran up to the podium where Eric Johnson, who was to become mayor later, was the lunch chairman. He was president then of a local civic group called the Citizens Council of Dallas, a very powerful political organization, and he was up on the podium. I rushed up to him. I said, "Mr. Johnson, we think something terrible has happened. We don't know for sure, but we think the president and Governor Connolly have been shot." I'll never forget, he just stared down at me for a moment from up there, just in shock. And he said, "Well, I think we'll wait a few minutes." And a few minutes later, he called on Reverend Luther Holcomb to do a prayer. Luther Holcomb was to do the invocation. He ended up doing the prayer. I rushed out of the building quick as I could because I wanted to find out where Governor Connolly was. Rushed out. As luck would have it, a friend of mine from Fort Worth was pulling up in her car to come to the luncheon. I commandeered her in the car, and she rushed me to Parkland. I got over to Parkland. I'll never forget, Of course, I didn't see the emergency entrance at all. I went to the front door, the end door, and it was wide open. I remember thinking, the president of the free world is here, and the doors are open, no security, nobody. So I just walked in the door at the end door and quickly found a nurse and told her I wanted to find Miss Connolly. She quickly took me to Miss Connolly. I found her in a dark hall. Immediately across from her, she was alone. Immediately across the hall from her was Jackie Kennedy, also totally alone. Someone had placed 2 straight chairs outside Trauma Room 1 and Trauma Room 2. The president was in Trauma Room 1. Governor Connolly was in Trauma Room 2. I felt out of place. What was I doing there? Neither spoke a word. I went to Nellie. I knew the press would be crawling all over us shortly, and I had to know what had happened in the car. So I got with her. She was very calm, very calm. He was already in surgery inside. We quickly put together a little sketch of the seating arrangement in the limousine. And she told me the story, what I just told you, that everybody was so buoyant, so happy, that she had just turned to him and made that statement about Dallas loving him. I took that information, excused myself from her, rushed down and found Malcolm Kilduff, who was the press officer on duty from Washington. Found him, and he and I quickly set up an informal press desk, sort of, in the nurses' training room. Well, the press by this time was coming. They were gathering around us. They'd found their way. He and I quickly put that together, and about 25 minutes later, he got up and made the statement that the president was dead. There's a picture of that, of his statement. It's in my book. I'm sorry I don't have it on video for you to see, but it's one of the most stark pictures I've ever seen in my life. When you see the faces of the reporters looking up at him in disbelief. I see, Ann, you're opening one of them now, but it's an incredible picture. Just eats on you when you look at it. Immediately following that, immediately after that, I got up and briefed the press. And can we roll that now, please, on video?
I'm Julian Reed, R-E-A-D, aide to Governor Connolly.
Could you describe the seating position in the automobile?
Yes. The president was seated in the right rear seat. Opposite in the left rear was Mrs. Kennedy. Immediately ahead of the president on a jump seat was Governor Connolly. And immediately opposite him was Mrs. Connolly. Farther up, of course, we had Secret Service, as you know. As Mrs. Connolly recalls, just before they reached the triple underpass, the shot rang out, the first shot, and she feels quite sure that it did hit the president. Governor Connolly, who was seated here, turned immediately to see what happened, and as he turned, he was struck. The president, according to Mrs. Connolly, immediately slumped, and Mrs. Kennedy grabbed him. A moment later, Governor Connolly slumped, and Mrs. Connolly grabbed him. Both women grabbed the men almost simultaneously and ducked as much as possible to guard against any possible gunfire following that. Mrs. Connolly says that the next thing she recalls is a Secret Service man picking up a telephone in the car and giving instructions of, let's proceed direct to the nearest hospital.
This is Dr. Shah later the same day briefing the press on Governor Connolly.
I'm Dr. Robert R. Shaw, professor of thoracic surgery at Southwestern Medical School. Because of this position, I accepted the responsibility of taking care of Governor Connolly for the...
Doctor, we'll have to start all over now. Thank you very much.
Again.
I'm Dr. Robert R. Shaw, professor of thoracic surgery at Southwestern Medical School. Because of my position, I accepted the responsibility of taking care of Governor Connolly following his injury. I want to say at the outset that the condition of the governor is quite satisfactory in view of the injury that he has sustained. He seemed to have been struck by just one bullet, which entered the right posterior chest close to the shoulder blade and coursed downward along the chest wall, taking out and fragmenting a portion of the fifth rib on the right. The bullet then emerged from the chest, evidently struck his right wrist, fracturing the lower portion of the right radius, and then entered the left thigh where it was spent. The thigh wound is trivial. The fracture of the radius should heal without difficulty or without further disability. Our major problem was the sucking wound of the right chest wall, because in making the wound of the chest, the fragments of the fifth rib became what we refer to as secondary missiles, and these caused a considerable amount of tissue damage in the point where the missile emerged from the chest. When the wound had been enlarged in order to remove damaged tissue, the lung could be inspected. It was found that there was a tear in the middle lobe of the lung, which had to be repaired. There was also a small hole in the lower lobe, undoubtedly due to a small rib fragment. This was of no consequence. The major problem was a matter of completely controlling all bleeding points, removing all damaged muscle and tissue, and then securing a tight closure of the chest wall so that the right lung could be re-expanded. The governor's condition was good during all of this. He was perfectly lucid before anesthesia was started. And from what we know about his injury and his condition at the present time, we have no reason to believe that he won't completely recover without significant disability of any sort.
Has it been definitely determined one bullet?
Really a reconstruction of what must have happened, but assuming, of course, that we know that the governor was in a sitting position. We know that the wound of entrance is alongside the shoulder blade here, that the wound of exit was here. We speculate that his arm perhaps was about in this position, and that it fractured his arm here and then went on with him sitting into his left thigh. This is a matter of trying to reconstruct the trajectory of the bullet. He was shot from above, and he was in a sitting position. So we feel that this is all one bullet. That no, that's
The question was asked,
yes,
did the lung collapse?
Collapsed. However, don't stress that point. The lung can be easily re-expanded. It's like a balloon. You can let it down and blow it up again.
Doctor, what are the chances of complications for a man his age?
The lung is now re-expanded. Mm-hmm.
Was he given a large quantity of blood?
Was he given a large quantity of
The governor
blood?
had lost approximately 1,500 cc's of blood. We counted in units, 500 cc's to a unit, and this is what has been given back to him.
Okay. Can you hold that just a second? This is a press conference that Mrs. Connolly had on Sunday morning. The original, obviously, was Friday afternoon. On Sunday morning, the press, of course, wanted to hear from her. And so George Christian and I put together a statement for her. George was his official press secretary. So then she spoke to the press on Sunday morning, okay? Okay, let's roll.
Words cannot fully express to Mrs. Kennedy and to the President's family our feelings, which we know all Texans share. Our son John will be our personal representative at the funeral of the President in Washington Monday. The Governor joins me in asking that all Texans observe the day of mourning Monday in memory of the President. Speaking again for the Governor and myself, I want to express our deepest appreciation for the wonderful friendship of so many fine people. We have received many telegrams, phone calls, and personal visits, for which we are very grateful. I especially appreciate the friendship and warmth of the people of Dallas, both before and after the terrible tragedy. We would also like to thank those who have sent so many beautiful flowers to the hospital. It is our hope that our friends who might wish to do this would instead contribute to the fund for the family of Officer Tippit. Our grief is all the greater because of his sacrifice. The Governor is now apparently out of danger. I talked to him just now, and he asked me to tell everyone he's going to be all right. He's in good spirits, and we deeply appreciate the care he has received at Parkland Hospital from the doctors, the nurses, and the staff.
Okay, that was Sunday morning. We went back to the hospital room and watched all the ceremonies that were taking place in Washington that morning, if you remember. And we hadn't been in there more than 15 or 20 minutes, and all of a sudden, on that black and white TV set, we, like all the rest of you in the world, saw Oswald murdered on live television. It wasn't more than another 15 or 20 minutes that we watched him on the gurney rolling down the hallway. And I will never forget, he was as green as a gourd, long gone. So that was part of what I lived with 3 days and 3 nights. A lot of interesting sidelights to that. For example, the first day when we were all gathered the first time, put that little press room together, midnight that night, this all happened maybe, 2 o'clock maybe? Before midnight that night, I'm still up at desk. Here comes a whole new wave of reporters from Europe. They got here just as fast as they could. 15 or 20 correspondents with decidedly non-Texan accents. We knew they weren't from here. That just demonstrated the impact of his death far beyond our shores, that he was so well known and followed in Europe so much that they came en masse as fast as they could get here. As I said, I stayed there 3 days and 3 nights. Governor Connolly was there 10 days. We kept getting requests from the media. They wanted to hear from Governor Connolly. Well, I wasn't going to put him out there for a press conference. He was too weak, had his arm hanging, dangling up above him, and still very weak. But what we decided to do was have one reporter. We'd select one reporter, and he would do what we call a pool coverage for all the media. Select one correspondent, and you make it available to everybody. So we did that. We found Martin Agronsky, NBC reporter, a very good guy we had worked with and we knew well. They found him at Arlington National Cemetery late in the evening. Put him on a midnight plane, flew him to Dallas. He slept a few hours that morning, and at 4:15 that afternoon, we did a live bedside interview with Governor Connolly. And it was a remarkable thing. It happened, I don't know that it's ever happened before or since, but the ground rules to the media, this was also a rather historic time. Does anybody remember when we had only 3 networks? 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. We asked all of them to take it live, no taping, take it live simultaneously, all of them, no editing. Well, that was sort of unusual, but I felt it was justified because of his condition, and that's what we did. And to their credit, all three of them took it. I don't know if that's ever happened since, may have, but it'd be very rare. Maybe a funeral of a head of state or something. But anyway, it was weeks before, 10 days before Governor Connolly got back to the mansion. And Mark, I'm sure you remember that very fondly when your dad got back down there. Actually, the kids got to see him on Thanksgiving Day. Mark and his sister could not come up here earlier. His brother John came up here the day of the assassination. John came up here, but Nellie, Ms. Connolly told the rest of them they'd have to wait. But John was sent to Washington to represent the family at the funeral. I have a picture of that. Anyway, they got to come up here Thanksgiving, so they had Thanksgiving meal with him. And that was a happy day, I'm sure. Anyway, this story goes on and on and on. I'm not going to try to tell you all of it. But I do have a chapter called the Unfinished Itinerary. Everybody knows the general story, but a lot of people don't know what did not happen. The first thing that did not happen was the luncheon here in Trademark, because there was obviously chaos over that. People finally, when Eric Johnson announced he was dead, they filed out very quietly, of course. I remember there's a couple of pictures I remember very well. Two pictures. One was someone for the White House taking down the presidential seal off the wall. And then I saw a picture of a waiter, towering waiter, picking up unused plate off the podium, up the podium of the table, picking up also a napkin and wiping away the tears from his eyes. I'll never forget that image. Anyway, but then following that, obviously that evening there was to be the big fundraiser in Austin. We had sold thousands of tickets, a sellout at $100 a plate, which is a lot of money in those days. Here are all these people in town. We had thousands of them already in Austin. The rest of them were on their way in. Nobody knew what to do. Mark can tell you the story how when he got to the mansion from his school, there were 30 or 40 people wandering around inside the mansion, friends who got there quickly, and Mark was a very young man. And he said he'd never seen a lot of grown people cry. That was the atmosphere. That was what was going on at that moment. Ben Barnes, young Ben Barnes, in his first term as a state legislator, who had been sort of the in-between advance man for Governor Connolly, working with the White House on all the trip arrangements, he had the idea of having a prayer meeting. And that's what they did. They had a joint session of the House and Senate in Austin, the legislature, and the public was invited. Everyone who was there for the dinner that night attended. And of course, it was a very somber occasion, but it gave everybody somewhere to go. Afterward, coincidentally, every person who bought a ticket got a memorial plaque, a memorial package, with a recording of his previous speeches and other things related to that night. So that was what did not happen in Austin. There's a picture in my book of the Coliseum in Austin, empty chairs, huge empty tables. The only thing you see otherwise in that hall is a presidential seal still hung on the back of the hall. So that's what did not happen in Austin. Most people also did not know that they were going to conclude the trip as overnight guests of the president at the ranch. And of course, there'd been enormous attention given to make everything just right for the president and first lady. Ms. Johnson sent her top assistant in Washington down to make sure it got done right. They spent days getting stuff together. Everything from working to bake pies, everything in the world. They'd heard that Jackie liked champagne on the rocks. So they had a planning session to figure out, how do you serve champagne on the rocks? What do you want to put it in? They dealt with things like that. They heard that the president liked corn soup. So they cooked up a big pot of corn soup for him to get that late that night. Well, obviously, he didn't have any of that. The butler, who'd been out there for 70 years, 60 years, I guess, he had the job of preparing the president's bed. As you know, the president had a severe back problem. And with him always went a special board that went into a bed for his back. So he had the bed prepared all but for that board. The board never came. So that's what didn't happen at the White House, this Texas White House. One of the humorous things that happened on that trip, preparing for the president to arrive, his assistant tells a story that Lyndon Johnson himself urged her, he said to her, please don't let me bring them in through the kitchen. Because the way the White House, the way the ranch house is laid out, there's an airstrip in the back where most of the guests come in, the special guests come in, and they have golf carts to bring them into the back door. And the back door comes through the kitchen. And you got the ice machine, you got the beer cooler, you got the washing machine, everything's in the kitchen. And he didn't want to come in that way for obvious reasons. And he kept telling her, don't let me do that. You make me come in with them through the front door, through the pretty part of the house. Well, you didn't have to worry about that either. So where are we today, 50 years later? I think we're all here because we have an interest in this endearing story. One of the things that gives me some comfort as we reach this milestone is what is happening in preparation for that 50th. I think you all know what's happening here, obviously, and I think we're all very proud of the mayor and Lynn Adams and her forces for putting together something really tasteful. I think all of you are aware of what's going to take place here, a simple one-hour ceremony out in Dealey Plaza with the noted historian, who's going to do the 1 hour, not a 1 hour speech, a 1 hour ceremony totally. But you may not be aware that that also has inspired a lot of other things going on across the state. Obviously, the 6th floor museum will be a mecca for all the reporters that are here all the time, plus tens of thousands of people. But in Fort Worth, just 30 miles away, on the same piece of dirt where he spoke in Fort Worth, City of Fort Worth Downtown Association has created a magnificent JFK Salute Plaza. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful place. You need to see it if you care about this story. And the key point of that is an 8-foot bronze that is a centerpiece of that. It's a beautiful place. So that's new, sort of. It was dedicated in November last year. The other thing that's happening over there, I told you about the artwork, remember? 50 years later, a young Frenchman who was 7 years old, lived in Casablanca. After he had been curator at the Louvre, and after he had come to Dallas and took a job at the Dallas Museum of Art, he was at a friend's home one day, and a friend told him, this picture hung in the Texas Hotel years ago. And he said, you got to be kidding. We have to reassemble that art for the 50th anniversary. So he had the vision, curator of the Dallas Museum, a gentleman, very Frenchman, Olivier Millet, I think is the way, or close to the way he pronounces his name. So he contacted Dr. Andrew Walker, who is the director of the Fort Worth Amon Carter Museum. They joined forces and went out and recollected all but 3 pieces of that original collection. They had 3 pieces they couldn't acquire, but otherwise the whole thing was reassembled, and there was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful catalog printed, which is still available. It's gorgeous. The Dallas Museum of Art has had that on display up until about a month ago, maybe 2 months now, I guess, maybe more. It is now at the Amon Carter in Fort Worth, and will be on exhibition there through the 12th or 15th of January. It's a wonderful display. If you're interested in this, I urge you to go see it. It's wonderful. So that's Fort Worth. That's another thing that's happening in Fort Worth. In addition to that, the Fort Worth Public Library and nearby Arlington, Texas, University of Texas Library at Arlington, have magnificent photo exhibits. Both libraries do. In fact, in Fort Worth, on Friday the 15th, I believe it is, Bob Schieffer is going to do a program there from CBS. So that's a lot going on in Fort Worth. In Austin, the LBJ Library will have special exhibits, and one of the favorites of mine is the words of Lady Bird Johnson. Mrs. Johnson was noted for keeping a diary on her recorder of all of her life, all of her political life with Johnson. She recorded 4 days of her activities around the assassination, and to hear her very soft voice talk about those days, you could hear it at the library. It's worth going to have the trouble to do it. One of the things that she comments on is how kind Jackie was to her, both on the plane and after they got back to Washington. That's been lost. I've never read much about that, but it's in her words. It's her own words. Of course, they also have the LBJ Ranch west of Austin is open, and now the home is open. Remember, it was the Texas White House during his administration, and it's free to the public, and it's open. All the back door and the kitchen door and all that I told you about is all available now. In San Antonio, and this is a little known thing, I told you that was his first stop. For that event, a craftsman created a magnificent podium, wood podium, for him to speak. That was the whole purpose of the podium. His first speech in Texas. For years, they argued down there about who that belonged to and who would get it. It is now at the Whitty Museum, the Whitty Art Museum in San Antonio, and that's on exhibit from now through the assassination period. So these are all, I call it a mosaic of honor that has sprung up organically. Nobody coordinated all this. It's just happening. And to me, I think that is a wonderful thing happening on the 50th anniversary. There is no way that with the museum here or with all these activities that we can ever erase all the hurt and sorrow of that time. But I do hope and believe that all of what's happening right now can help all of us and people around the world come to peace with this tragedy. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Take a few questions.
Sure.
If you wouldn't mind reading them out so that people can hear.
Sure, of course. Okay, we have some questions here. Did the governor believe the theory that shots were directed at him? No. Doesn't take me long to answer that. I've heard that, of course, and it is a popular question, I must say. Practical answer. Governor Connolly could have been shot anywhere, anytime. He and I countless times have walked from the Capitol to the Driscoll Hotel and down Congress Avenue without any sign of security around us. He wouldn't even let the Capitol guards go with him. So it's nonsense. It's a theory, but I give no credence to it whatsoever. Okay. Do you think it will happen again? I fear it will happen again. I confess that thought comes to me too often. We're in a very violent society, and in spite of all precautions, which of course are enormous now, whoever is in a position of power, there are always people who don't like you, and it could happen. I pray it does not happen. Your opinion of conspiracy theories. Well, we have plenty of them. In fact, I am expecting another crop. I'm surprised that there haven't been some already come out, but the curator here, Mr. Gary Mack, he is the specialist in theories. Gary is a great resource. He's helped me a great deal in this book, as has everybody. I won't say this publicly. The staff, Nicola and the staff here at this magnificent place, has just been wonderful to work with in pursuing this project, and I thank them very much. But he several things about to elaborate on that a little bit. People still believe there is. I'm told, I think I'm pretty much on line, that 60% of the people come through here think there was something else, whatever that means, you know. So it's still out there. I was told that Oliver Stone's film actually created more interest in the museum, and isn't that right, Lindeland? As Mack describes, he says it turned the historic event into a mystery, and the mystery endures. And, now, if you've seen the museum, you know that there's plaques up there. They list about 6 or 8 of the most prominent theories. So you can get a capsule here of seeing each one, whether you're talking about the mafia or you're talking about the New Orleans guy or whoever, whatever your choice, whatever your taste. You can see them, you can read a summary of what they are. You don't have that, but the museum goes out of its way to not make any judgments. They don't endorse anything. The museum is based on fact. Madeline? Fact only. Any other questions? I've stayed a long time, so, okay?
Help me in thanking Julian Reed for sharing his memories.
Thank you very much. Thank you.